you were kind of the primary suspect in this homicide
I still
investigation. You still are. What are your thoughts about that, and what are your emotions right now? What's kind of going through your head?
It's very stressful, but I hope they will be found, and I hope we can move forward from this.
A face that looks innocent and a body that can't seem to stay still. That was Robert Leeming. At first glance, he appeared harmless. But once you dive into the full context behind that interview, you'll quickly realize he's anything but innocent. In May of 2019, his live-in partner and her young child vanished without a trace for weeks. While Robert was out giving interviews, investigators were working tirelessly to uncover the truth. And what they discovered next will make you question everything you thought you knew. The horrifying details were so chilling and brutal that the case earned him the nickname Canada's Chris Watts. And by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why. To really dive into this story, let's rewind to 2017. That's when Jasmine Lovett and Roby Anderson welcomed their first baby, a daughter named Aaliyah Sanderson. At the time, Jasmine and Roby weren't married, and they were both pretty young. Jasmine was in her early 20s, and by all accounts, she was a strikingly beautiful woman. But as with many relationships, things weren't as perfect as they may have seemed on the outside. After Aaliyah was born, cracks started to show in Jasmine and Roby's relationship. According to reports, Roby began coming home later and later, leaving Jasmine alone with their newborn. Then, things took a turn for the worse when he started showing up drunk or high. That behavior only escalated, and soon Roby was becoming more aggressive. One day, Roby came home, and things quickly escalated when he aggressively demanded money from Jasmine. She was terrified for her safety and ran into the bathroom to call the police. By the time the police arrived, Roby was gone, and since Jasmine hadn't been physically harmed, they told her there wasn't much they could do at that point. However, Jasmine managed to get an emergency protection order against Roby. But just 13 days later, the order was revoked after Jasmine and Roby claimed they had worked things out. They told authorities they didn't need the order anymore, though the details of what happened between them during that time remain unclear. What we do know for sure is that Jasmine and Roby eventually split up, and Jasmine got custody of Aaliyah. After the breakup, Jasmine and Roby managed to keep things relatively civil. They focused on co-parenting and tried their best to maintain a peaceful environment for their daughter, despite the challenges of their past. Keep in mind that this all took place in 2018, and during all the emotional turmoil, Jasmine found solace in her family, whom she was very close to. Reports mention that Jasmine was especially close to her mom and sister. They often gathered for family dinners, and she kept them updated on everything happening in her life. After months of navigating heartbreak, Jasmine decided it was time to start putting herself out there again, so she joined a few dating sites in hopes of meeting someone new. And it wasn't long before Jasmine met Robert Leeming, a man who seemed to meet her high standards. At the time they met, Robert was 34 years old, about 10 years older than Jasmine, who was in her mid-20s. While the age gap wasn't huge, it was still noticeable. Robert was originally from the United Kingdom, but had moved around a lot as a child due to his father's military career. This constant moving made it hard for him to form lasting friendships, an issue that continued into his adult life. Despite his struggles with socializing, Robert found a way to connect with others online, where he felt more comfortable. He loved chatting in online forums and meeting people without the pressure of face-to-face interaction. It was actually in one of these chat rooms that he met his first wife, a Canadian woman who was studying to become a teacher. They married in 2013, and Robert moved to Canada to be with her. They had a son together, but unfortunately, the marriage didn't last, and by 2017, they had separated. Robert's ex-wife received full custody of their son, with Robert only having supervised visitation. Although Robert and his ex-wife were no longer together, He stayed in Canada thanks to his permanent residency status, which he had earned through his job as a heavy goods vehicle mechanic. After his marriage ended, Robert, like Jasmine, turned to dating sites, where he dated several women before finally meeting Jasmine. Now, their whirlwind relationship began in September of 2018, and just a month later, Jasmine and her young daughter, Aaliyah, were moving into Robert's home. It was a bold step, one that raised eyebrows, especially with a child in the mix. Moving in after only 1 month of dating is fast by most standards, but for them, it seemed like the logical choice at the time. Financially, it made sense. Sharing a home meant cutting costs in half, something many people can appreciate in today's economy. Unlike a roommate setup, living with a partner offers more than just a practical split of rent. There's someone to help with groceries, chores, and in Jasmine's case, childcare. With no job at the time, Jasmine relied on child support from her ex while dedicating herself to raising Aaliyah. Having Robert step in to help with Aaliyah must have been a welcome relief. And help he did. Robert was more than eager to pitch in. Whether it was cooking, cleaning, or watching Aaliyah while Jasmine ran errands, he seemed to embrace his new role wholeheartedly. His love for Aaliyah was obvious. He treated her like his own, and for Jasmine, that made all the difference. From the outside, things looked perfect. Jasmine's family thought so too. She remained close to her mother and sister Genevieve, frequently meeting them for family dinners. When Robert began joining these gatherings, her family welcomed him. He seemed kind, attentive, and genuinely invested in Jasmine and Aaliyah. But not everyone was entirely on board. Genevieve, always protective of her sister, couldn't shake her unease. The relationship was moving too fast for her liking, and while Robert's care for Aaliyah and Jasmine was clear, Genevieve couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something wasn't quite right. Then came April 14th, 2019. A family dinner like any other. Jasmine, Robert, and Aaliyah joined the usual gathering. But this time, something was off. Genevieve couldn't help but notice that Jasmine and Robert seemed distant, a little more reserved than usual. It was subtle, but enough to make her wonder. Still, the dinner ended without incident, and the sisters even made plans to meet again on Good Friday, April 19th. But when the day came, Jasmine never showed up. No call, no text, nothing. This was completely out of character. Jasmine was someone who always kept her commitments, especially with family. Genevieve's worry grew with every unanswered call and text. She even tried messaging Jasmine on Facebook, but her messages weren't just ignored. They were marked undelivered. Unable to shake her concern, Genevieve drove to Jasmine and Robert's house that evening around 5 p.m. The basement light was on, a sign that someone had to be home. She knocked on the door. No answer. She rang the doorbell. Still nothing. She waited, knocked again, and even tried peeking inside, but the house remained eerily silent. With no way to reach her sister, Genevieve left, hoping she was overthinking things. 2 days later, on April 21st, Jasmine's mother, Kim, decided to visit the house herself. Like Genevieve, she was met with silence. Knocking, ringing the doorbell, it was all futile. But as she prepared to leave, Kim noticed something strange near the front door. 2 pairs of sneakers. One pair was freshly cleaned, still soaking wet, and placed neatly by the entrance. Though her mother hadn't received any response, she left a note on the front door of Jasmine and Robert's home. It was probably a message urging them to get in touch, hoping that either Jasmine or Robert would finally respond. But the days went by, and still, there was no word from Jasmine. By April 23rd, 4 days after leaving the note, the family's concern had reached a boiling point. Jasmine had missed several planned check-ins, and on this day, she was supposed to meet her mother and sister for another family dinner. This dinner was a long-standing tradition for the family, and missing it was something Jasmine would never do. Despite the growing worry, the family still clung to a small thread of hope. Maybe something had come up, or maybe there was a misunderstanding. But as the hours ticked by and Jasmine didn't show up, that hope began to fade. This was the moment that everything shifted for Genevieve. She was beyond worried. The feeling that something was terribly wrong weighed heavily on her, and she couldn't ignore the sinking feeling in her gut. So, she decided to go to the police station and file a missing persons report. And she was determined to do whatever she could to help find her sister. She handed over her phone, answered every question the police had, and provided a full account of everything she knew about Jasmine's life in recent months. Initially, detectives considered the possibility that Jasmine had left voluntarily. However, Genevieve immediately dismissed the idea. Her sister would never abandon her family, especially not without contacting someone, least of all with her young daughter, Aaliyah, left behind. Jasmine was deeply devoted to her child and her family. Disappearing without a trace simply wasn't in her character. Investigators also turned their attention to Jasmine's ex, Roby, wondering if he might be connected to her disappearance. Genevieve clarified that while Roby was no longer involved in Jasmine's life, he had relinquished his parental rights to Aaliyah, which meant he was no longer obligated to pay child support. While this had added financial strain on Jasmine, there had been no indications of lingering conflict between them. After investigating further, police ruled him out as a suspect. However, when the detectives began looking deeper into Jasmine's relationship with her current partner, Robert, they found themselves uncovering a much more complicated situation than they had initially imagined. So, back in December of 2018, Jasmine had confided in her sister, Genevieve, about the troubles she was facing with Robert. Their relationship was strained, and they had actually broken up. However, they decided to continue living under the same roof as roommates. It was an unusual arrangement, especially considering there's a toddler in the house. But Jasmine explained it as a practical decision. Moving out with a toddler is not only difficult, but also costly. She justified it as a temporary solution, hoping they could figure things out. And just a few weeks later, Jasmine told Genevieve that they had reconciled and decided to give their relationship another shot. However, the troubles didn't end there. Jasmine revealed another personal detail to her sister that added yet another layer of complexity to the situation. During their period of separation, she had become pregnant. But instead of continuing with the pregnancy, Jasmine made the difficult decision to terminate it. The emotional weight of that choice seemed to linger, and it was unclear whether it played a role in the breakup, their reconciliation, or in something deeper that was affecting their relationship. As time went on, financial stress began to build. With Roby no longer providing child support for Aaliyah, Jasmine found herself carrying the full burden of providing for both herself and her daughter. While she hadn't yet secured a job, she was determined to find work. In fact, Jasmine longed to return to the workforce, not just for financial reasons, but also to feel productive and to have more interaction with other adults. She even admitted to feeling jealous when Robert left for work each day, while she stayed behind to care for Aaliyah. Now, Genevieve's account convinced detectives that this was no runaway case. Something else had happened to Jasmine, and the police wasted no time launching a full-scale investigation. Within days, they pieced together a timeline of events leading up to her disappearance. As mentioned earlier, Jasmine and her daughter Aaliyah were last seen at a family dinner on April 14th, and everything seemed perfectly normal. On April 15th, CCTV footage captured them at a local grocery store. Jasmine appeared calm and collected as she paid for her groceries at a self-checkout, with Aaliyah peacefully nestled in her stroller. The following day, April 16th, was when the first hint of something troubling began to unfold. Robert dropped Aaliyah off at daycare at precisely 7:12 in the morning. Everything appeared fine as usual, but things took a strange twist later in the day. At 4:46 p.m., Robert returned to pick up Aaliyah, but there was a problem. He wasn't on the authorized pickup list. This wasn't a small detail. In order to take Aaliyah home, Robert had to call Jasmine, who then had to personally authorize the daycare staff to release Aaliyah into his care. Now, while this was certainly unusual, it wasn't the most alarming part. What happened after that was. Jasmine and Aaliyah would never be seen or heard from again. By the way, I post true crime and new cases here every week, so if that sounds like your kind of thing, please consider subscribing. It helps a lot. Days went by without a trace. Then on April 18th, an odd clue surfaced. Jasmine's credit card was used to place a food delivery order, but the authorities couldn't confirm whether Jasmine herself had placed the order or if someone else had gained access to her card, but it was clear that whoever had used it was still connected to her in some way. By now, the focus of the investigation had shifted to Robert. After all, he had been the last person seen with both Jasmine and Aaliyah. Genevieve, Jasmine's sister, had already told the authorities about the tension in Jasmine and Robert's relationship, their breakup, their reconciliation, and the strain they were under. This information made Robert an even more important person of interest. It seemed fair to question him, especially considering all the recent turmoil in their relationship. So, on April 24th, the police decided it was time for a welfare check at Robert's home. What happened next was strange and unsettling. The officers knocked on the door, but no one answered. They knocked again. And again. It was like a game of Groundhog Day, repeated knocks, but still no response. Then, the officers noticed something strange. The note that Jasmine's mother had left on the door just days earlier was still there. It was almost as if it had been waiting for them. But that wasn't the only odd detail. The front door's window, which had previously been clear, was now covered with something that looked like cellophane, the kind of clear plastic used to wrap gifts. It was the only window on the door that was covered, and it completely obstructed the view into the house. This made it impossible to see what was happening inside. The officers kept knocking, rang the doorbell, and waited. The atmosphere was tense, like something was being hidden. While waiting, one officer noticed a wet trunk liner lying over the air conditioner, seemingly drying out. It was obvious the trunk liner had been recently cleaned. In addition, the garden hose had been unwound, which suggested it had been used to rinse something down, likely the trunk liner. This observation immediately brought to mind the sneakers Jasmine's mother had seen earlier, which had been soaked and washed. A lot of signs were pointing to a cleanup, but what was being hidden? Then, as they continued to observe, they realized something. This house hadn't been abandoned. Someone had been there, cleaning and moving things around. The only problem was that the police couldn't get inside just for a welfare check. The locked door and the covered windows left them with no easy way in. But the officers weren't ready to give up. They decided to get creative and called the fire department. With the help of a ladder truck, they managed to peer into the windows of the upper floors, hoping to catch a glimpse of something that could give them more information. Unfortunately, they saw nothing through the windows. But as soon as the fire truck arrived, the lights inside the house flickered on, and moments later, Robert opened the front door. Of course, the officers questioned him. And his response? Well, take a look at this.
I was sleeping. I sleep with plugs in and... Hey, but we've been here for hours and hours and hours now, hey? Banging on your door and...
Ringing the doorbell.
Calling your phone. Again. I've been drinking and smoking a lot, so...
Okay.
Okay, so she's not with her sister.
What do you mean?
Well, that's the reason that we're here,
Why do you think we're here?
is that the family's calling us saying we haven't heard from our daughter and our sister.
Yeah, it makes sense.
Okay, that makes sense?
Yeah.
Okay, why does that make sense?
Because I haven't heard from her either.
At this point, the officers knew they needed to dig deeper. They asked Robert about Jasmine's car, and he explained that she didn't drive. That seemed odd, considering she was a grown adult and should have some means of transportation. They also noticed the note on the door that Jasmine's mother had left behind, but Robert claimed he had no idea about it. The situation was becoming more bizarre with each passing moment. The officers were growing increasingly suspicious of Robert's behavior. His responses were erratic, and his story didn't seem to add up. As they pressed him for more details, it felt like Robert was either hiding something important or just completely out of touch with reality. So, determined to get to the bottom of things, the officers decided to take a closer look at Robert's past. As it turns out, Robert had a record of emotional abuse in his previous relationship. His ex-wife had reported that he would gaslight her, call her crazy, and emotionally mistreat her. It seemed that Robert's neglect and verbal mistreatment were a big part of what led to their divorce. But it didn't stop there. His ex-wife also reported that Robert had a growing collection of guns and knives, which alarmed her to the point that she feared for her safety and the safety of their child. The officers dug even further into Robert's history and found that his ex had also reported him for animal mistreatment. Apparently, Robert had taken the dog they once owned together to a park, tied it to a tree without food or water, and left it there. Thankfully, someone at the park noticed the dog and brought it to the Humane Society. Now, this was a huge red flag. Anyone who is cruel to an animal is likely to become cruel to humans too, and Robert's actions toward animals raised serious concerns. He was charged with animal abuse and pled guilty to 3 charges: causing an animal to be in distress, failing to provide an animal with food and water, and failing to provide an animal with shelter. While he didn't serve jail time, he was slapped with a hefty fine of $5,000 and was banned from owning animals for 10 years. But Robert's troubling history doesn't stop there. During the divorce hearings, Robert's ex-wife uncovered some seriously disturbing stuff. She found some chilling internet searches on Robert's phone. One was about chaining a dog to a tree, which, considering his history, definitely set off alarm bells. But the next search, it was even worse. It was about a mother and child dying in a house fire. Just imagine how terrified his ex must have felt. After what he'd already done to that dog, she couldn't help but fear that he might do something much worse to her and her son. With all this terrifying new info about Robert's past, the police decided it was time to get serious. On April 25th, they arrested him in connection with the disappearances of Jasmine and Aaliyah and brought him in for a formal interrogation. When asked about the last time he saw Jasmine and Aaliyah, Robert said that on April 17th, they had gone on a picnic at Bragg Creek, about 30 minutes from his home. Afterward, they all returned to the house. According to Robert, Jasmine sat on the couch, watching TV while he got ready for a date. Keep in mind, Robert had been telling people that he and Jasmine were just roommates at this point, and he even claimed he'd been seeing another woman for quite some time. Robert went on to say everything seemed perfectly fine with Jasmine before he left for his date, but when he came back that night, Jasmine and Aaliyah were nowhere to be found. This raised some serious red flags for the investigators, especially since Jasmine's family had told them that Robert and Jasmine were in a serious relationship after their breakup. The officers decided to reach out to the woman Robert said he was dating that night, a woman we'll call Kate. When they spoke with her, Kate confirmed she had indeed been with Robert on the night Jasmine and Aaliyah disappeared. The police dug deeper, asking Kate some follow-up questions. She revealed that she and Robert had met online in February of 2019, roughly 5 months after Jasmine and Aaliyah had moved in with him. They'd gone on some dates, and Robert occasionally stayed at Kate's house. It didn't seem like he was trying to hide the relationship, but here's the kicker. Kate told the police she had never been to Robert's place. Every time she asked why, he claimed his room was messy and that he had a roommate. He even referred to Jasmine as his tenant, not his girlfriend. But as strange as all of this was, the police couldn't just jump to conclusions. Even though they were suspicious, they didn't have enough to tie him directly to Jasmine and Aaliyah's disappearance. So, Robert was released, but not without a few conditions. His car and phone were seized, and they obtained a search warrant for his townhouse. They told him he couldn't go home until they were done investigating. Over the next few days, the police combed through everything. They looked into Robert's phone data and uncovered that On April 23rd, the day Jasmine and Aaliyah were reported missing, Robert had deleted around 30 photos of the two of them. He'd also deleted some photos of a gun. And, to make matters worse, his phone's location data showed he had been in the Bragg Creek area at the time Jasmine and Aaliyah went missing. Remember, he had claimed they went there for a picnic, but the timing was very suspicious. So, the police decided they needed to check out this creek area. When they searched it, they discovered a makeshift fire pit that looked freshly used, but not for cooking hot dogs or s'mores. As they examined the area, they found some truly disturbing items: a car seat belt, toddler shoes, diapers, parts of children's books, and a Jungle Book DVD. Scent dogs were brought in, and they alerted to the presence of an accelerant used to start the fire. The investigation didn't stop there. CCTV footage from a local gas station showed Robert filling up his car and a gas can, followed by him going through a car wash. But it was what they found when they searched his home that was even stranger. The front door had been barricaded with 2 long poles, and as mentioned earlier, the window was covered in cellophane. Multiple spots on the walls had also been sanded down and cleaned. Inside, they found more oddities: a plastic hammer filled with sand and boxes of blue moving blankets. They also found a gun safe, packed with multiple guns and boxes of ammo. But what stood out most was a partially melted firearm part, infant toys, Jasmine's prescription bottles, and even her shredded passport in his trash can. But wait, there was something even stranger. They found raw strips of bacon scattered all over the house, thrown about like it was some sort of bizarre breadcrumb trail. One piece of raw bacon was found draped over a dining room chair, another in the garage, and yet another in the room with the furnace. As if that wasn't strange enough, an empty bacon package was sitting idly in the kitchen. But despite all the bizarre findings, there was still no sign of Jasmine or Aaliyah. Now, while all of this was unfolding, Robert himself was out there giving interviews, adamantly claiming that he had nothing to do with Jasmine and Aaliyah's disappearance.
You were kind of the primary suspect in this homicide
I still
investigation. You still are. What are your thoughts about that, and what are your emotions right now? What's kind of going through your head?
It's very stressful, but I hope they will be found, and I hope we can move forward from this. No, we were friends, absolutely friends, and supported each other. I would like, obviously, for them to be found, and for me to be cleared of this.
Your relationship with Jasmine?
Good.
I mean, were you a boyfriend, girlfriend, or?
No, just good friends. Nothing alarmed me until, of course, I got arrested. So.
What happens with you right now?
I'm just gonna wait until I get a phone call to say that I can go home.
How are you feeling throughout all of this?
Traumatized, of course.
Is there anything else that you want to add to all this?
Yeah, if anyone sees her or Aaliyah, Jasmine or Aaliyah, please, let the authorities know. They said that they would be done with the property today, and that I would be able to go back to the property. But
So you're hoping to sleep there tonight?
I hope to sleep somewhere tonight. Yes.
As you might have seen in the video, Robert appeared to be high or possibly intoxicated. According to him, that had been his life for the past few days. He claimed everyone thought he was a kidnapper or murderer, and as a result, he had lost his job, his friends had turned on him, and he had nothing to do but drink every day. He also complained bitterly about the police, saying they had destroyed his house and made a huge mess. Robert insisted that he was innocent and hired a lawyer, convinced that he needed help to prove it. But then, someone close to him came forward anonymously, revealing that Robert had a reputation for being a loose cannon and behaving erratically. Investigators believed this new information, as it fit the pattern of strange interactions they'd already had with him. It was yet another piece of the puzzle that made him look increasingly suspicious. Still, there wasn't enough evidence to press charges. So, the police decided to try a new strategy. On May 5th, 2 undercover officers approached Robert on the street near his home. Remember, Robert had been talking a lot about how his life was falling apart, how he had lost his job, his friends, and had no one to turn to. It seemed like this was exactly what the police were hoping for, because as soon as the officers started talking to him, Robert began to open up. The undercover officers kept complimenting him and boosting his ego, telling him they believed he was innocent. This flattery seemed to have an impact on Robert, making him more willing to talk to them. At one point during their conversation, the officers even told Robert a false story. They claimed that while the police were investigating his house, one of his neighbors had stolen evidence from the scene and given it to them. This wasn't true at all, but they hoped it would make Robert trust them more. They kept manipulating him by suggesting that he meet them for a beer, where they could talk about destroying the evidence together. Robert, clearly feeling lonely and vulnerable, agreed to meet up with them. But even though he seemed to be opening up, he was still a bit suspicious of the officers. He even asked them multiple times if they were really cops or if they were just trying to trick him. The undercover officers reassured him each time, convincing him that they weren't law enforcement. The officers continued their act, telling Robert crazy stories about how they were part of a criminal group, a gang with a lot of experience in illegal activities. They painted a picture of how bad the police were and how much they could help Robert. They even gave him advice on how to stop the cops from suspecting him, all while playing into his insecurities and fears. Eventually, the officers invited Robert to their so-called warehouse, which they made sound like some kind of secret hideout where they kept all their illegal weapons. Robert, desperate for someone to talk to and willing to take any support he could get, agreed to go with them. When they arrived at the warehouse, the officers showed him a collection of guns, hoping to make Robert believe that they were dangerous criminals. Seeing the weapons seemed to trigger something in Robert. He began to feel like he could trust these people who had been feeding him all these stories. So he started opening up more. He told them that when he and Jasmine were dating, he had cheated on her. He justified it by saying, "Every single guy does that." While this is clearly not true for everyone, it gave the officers even more insight into his mindset and character. According to Robert, Jasmine had wanted to get married, but he didn't, and this caused a lot of tension between them. As the conversation continued, Robert opened up even more. Despite only meeting these 2 officers 5 hours earlier, he confessed in detail, almost as if he was seeking validation or sympathy. He didn't clearly explain how he had killed Jasmine or her daughter Aaliyah, but he did share disturbing details. After killing them, Robert used his phone to find a remote area to dispose of their bodies. He chose Bragg Creek and drove there to check out the surroundings. He said he waited until the next day to hide the bodies, taking them to the woods near Bragg Creek. Once there, he buried them and drenched them in gasoline, although he didn't burn their bodies. His hope was that the smell of gasoline would confuse the cadaver dogs and prevent them from finding the remains. Robert's efforts to cover his tracks didn't stop there. He told the officers that he had also set up a makeshift fire pit to burn Jasmine and Elias's personal belongings. Items like Elias's car seat and other possessions were burned, all to make it look like Jasmine had simply taken her child and run away. Robert even went to the extent of covering the bodies in mulch because he believed the mulch would help mask the scent and confuse the cadaver dogs further. What struck the officers most was Robert's obsession with throwing off the cadaver dogs. He had bacon all over his house, and it wasn't just because he liked the smell of the meat. Robert explained that he had heard pork smells similar to human flesh, so he figured that the bacon would distract the dogs, preventing them from detecting the bodies. His plan seemed well thought out, almost like he had studied how to evade detection. He even commented on his old car, joking that if it had been a newer model, the police could easily track his movements. But since it wasn't, he felt like he had outsmarted them. And get this, Robert agreed to show the officers where he had hidden the bodies. So in the middle of the night, they drove to Bragg Creek, and Robert led them to the exact spot where he had buried Jasmine and Elias. The bodies were wrapped in blue moving blankets, buried under dirt, sticks, and mulch, not far from the makeshift fire pit. The fact that Robert brought the officers to the scene was chilling, as it showed just how proud he was of his actions. Many killers return to the scene of their crimes or keep mementos, and Robert seemed to take pleasure in showing off what he had done. The information Robert provided was more than enough for the police to arrest him immediately. The Calgary Police Department held a press conference soon after, but they didn't disclose all the details right away. DNA evidence confirmed the worst. The bodies found were those of Jasmine and her young daughter, Aaliyah. Jasmine had suffered brutal blunt force trauma to her head, with the added horror of a bullet wound behind her left ear. Aaliyah, too, endured savage blows, one to each side of her head, another to her back, and a spinal injury that made the fall theory impossible. Both deaths were ruled homicides, giving the authorities the green light to pursue murder charges, no longer just manslaughter. On the 7th of May, Robert's fate took a darker turn as he was officially charged with 2 counts of second-degree murder. While the prosecution briefly considered pushing for first-degree murder charges, they ultimately concluded they couldn't prove premeditation. But they were confident second-degree murder would be their focus, and they aimed for a solid conviction. As his trial unfolded in October of 2021, Robert's defense took an unexpected turn. He pled guilty to the murder of Jasmine but insisted, almost callously, that he had nothing to do with Aaliyah's death. Robert's defense team painted a chilling picture of what they claimed happened on April 17th. They argued that Robert had picked up Aaliyah from daycare and brought her home to an empty house. Jasmine was nowhere to be found. He and Aaliyah played together, watching her favorite show, The Wiggles. At some point, she wandered upstairs toward the kitchen, but tragically, she slipped and fell backward, hitting her head. Robert claimed she got up quickly, appearing fine. So they continued their evening, eating dinner and watching TV. Later, Robert put Aaliyah to bed, went outside to smoke a cigarette, and made himself a drink. Jasmine came home around 7 o'clock, and at about 9 o'clock she went upstairs to check on Aaliyah. What she found was every mother's nightmare. Her daughter wasn't breathing and was unresponsive in her bed. According to Robert, Jasmine immediately flew into a rage, accusing him of killing Aaliyah. But that accusation set Robert off. In a fit of anger, he said he grabbed a hammer and struck Jasmine repeatedly until she collapsed. To make sure she was truly dead, he then retrieved a gun and shot her. The story only worsened from there. Robert, in a macabre attempt to cover his tracks, wrapped Jasmine's lifeless body in a blue moving blanket, then used a towel to clean up the blood. He tossed the towels away, made himself another drink, and went to bed. Over the next several days, he buried their bodies and burned anything that might have tied him to the crime. However, the autopsy told a much darker story. The injuries to Aaliyah's head and spinal cord were far more severe than any fall could explain. The evidence was too clear. This wasn't an accident. Additionally, medical examiners claimed that Aaliyah had injuries to her genital area, suggesting possible harm in that part. This revelation led prosecutors to believe that when Jasmine returned home on April 17th, she caught Robert in the act. Fearing that Jasmine might expose what she had discovered, Robert reportedly killed her to silence her. In a panic, he then killed Aaliyah, fabricating the story about her accidental fall down the stairs to cover his tracks. This theory seemed to align with what Jasmine's family had said about Robert's behavior, how he doted on Aaliyah, picking her up, cooking for her, and spending time with her in a way that raised suspicions. Although many might argue that a good step-parent can show care for a child, Robert's excessive interest, especially in light of the medical examiner's findings, seemed more than just ordinary affection. What's particularly striking is that Robert never denied killing Aaliyah during his conversations with undercover cops. Instead, he framed it as an accident. Prosecutors argued that had Aaliyah's death been truly accidental, Robert would have been eager to make that clear, especially considering how horrific the idea of killing a child is. In court, they pointed out that Robert never once said that he didn't kill her. Instead, he stuck with the story he had told from the beginning. Robert himself took the stand as the sole witness for his defense, repeating the same account. Aaliyah had fallen down the stairs, hit her head, and died in her sleep. But his excuse didn't hold up, especially when it came to the claim that he couldn't call for help because he couldn't find his phone. In reality, Robert had his phone with him the entire time. Plus, authorities were able to track his text messages, including one sent to his mistress just before the killings. Despite these inconsistencies, Robert waived his right to a jury trial, allowing the judge to decide his fate. The judge found him guilty of second-degree murder in Aaliyah's death, stating that the injuries were not accidental and that Robert had intentionally caused harm. The judge also pointed out that Robert's actions, drinking and smoking after the murders instead of seeking help for Aaliyah, showed a clear lack of remorse. Robert was sentenced to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after 22 years. Jasmine's family was satisfied with the sentence, though they acknowledged that no amount of time would bring Jasmine and Aaliyah back. The family also found solace in knowing that their loved ones' legacies would live on through their charitable efforts. They raised $25,000 for the Calgary Women's Emergency Shelter and started a memorial scholarship in Jasmine's name to help other women who have survived domestic violence. In 2022, Robert appealed his conviction, arguing that the medical examiner couldn't rule out an accidental fall causing Aaliyah's fatal injuries. However, the appeal was rejected, and on July 23, 2024, his conviction was upheld. As for Jasmine and Aaliyah's families, they continue to honor their memories by raising awareness about domestic violence and supporting those affected. But many people felt that the sentence wasn't enough. With only 20 years and the possibility of parole, some believed it was too lenient, given the brutal and calculated way he took their lives. It definitely sparked a lot of debate. So, what do you think? Was the punishment fair considering the severity of the crimes, or do you think he deserved a harsher sentence? I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, so make sure to drop a comment below and let's talk about it. If you like the way we create these videos and you want to help bring more cases like this to light, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives. Thank you once again for watching.